Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Getty Museum virtual art break, reimagining medieval Camelot for today. I'm Larissa Grolemond, Assistant Curator of Manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, and I'm so happy to welcome you all to this conversation with author Kiersten White. I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge the Getty's presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva, Chumash, and Tataviam peoples, who have been here in what we now call Southern California since time immemorial. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands, waters, and islands. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Closed captioning has been enabled. To access live captioning, click the CC icon on your Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. And please use the Q&A box to ask questions. There'll be time for questions throughout the program and especially at the end of the conversation. I'm so pleased to have Kiersten White join me today for this conversation about the enduring appeal of King Arthur and his knights, and of course, the women who shaped those tales as well. Kiersten is the New York Times bestselling Bram Stoker award-winning and critically acclaimed author of many books, including the Anti-Darken trilogy, the Sinister Summer series, the Camelot Rising trilogy, and her upcoming adult debut, Hyde. Her books have been published in over 20 territories, and her novel, The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein, is currently in development with Sony Pictures Television. Kiersten lives with her family and their surly sulcata tortoise in San Diego. Welcome, Kiersten, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I've been really looking forward to this.
I'm so excited. Now, no spoilers, but could you maybe give us a brief synopsis of your Camelot Rising trilogy for those who haven't yet read it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Camelot Rising trilogy are 3 books centered around Guinevere. I wanted to do a historical fantasy retelling of the Arthurian legends, but I wanted to focus on Guinevere because I feel like she always gets the short end of the stick in retellings. And so it was really important to me to figure out who she was and who she could have been. So the Guinevere Deception features a young Guinevere coming to Camelot, not just to be Arthur's bride, but as a witch in disguise to be his magical bodyguard as Camelot is transitioning away from magic and toward a rule of law that knights can't protect Arthur from.
So this is such an interesting kind of take on really 900 years or so of Arthurian myth and legend. And so I thought for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the long history of Arthur, I might just kind of go through the history of these tales and kind of all the different forms they've taken, which I'm sure you're familiar with most of these, many of these, but just to provide a little context for the discussion. So as a medievalist, I'm of course interested in the medieval manuscript tradition of King Arthur and his tales. There are as many medieval variations of these stories as there are the published theatrical and cinematic versions of our more recent past. From the 1130s with Welsh cleric and writer Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of Kings of Britain to Chrétien de Troyes and Robert de Boron, the definitive version of the tale from the medieval period is that of Sir Thomas Malory's Death of King Arthur from 1485. And then the legend gradually developed over time, and we have lots of surviving artwork of Arthur and his knights, and I'm sure you even recognize some of these subjects from your own stories. And so King Arthur and his knights proved to be a really enduring source of inspiration for artists and creators of all kinds. The 18 and 1900s witnessed a boom in Arthuriana. So we have The Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson from 1859, which is a poetic version of Arthur's life that's largely based on Malory. We have these beautiful photographs from Julia Margaret Cameron, who was a close friend of Tennyson, and she liked to stage her close friends and family in the kind of guise of these different Arthurian characters and take these wonderful photographs of them. Arthur stories for children also become popular, and popular sites for illustration especially, including Howard Pyle's 1903, The Story of King Arthur and His Knights, which you can see down in the corner there. And probably the most influential modern literary version of Arthur is, of course, T.H. White, which I know that you're very familiar with, The Once and Future King of 1958, which portrays him as a 14th century Anglo-Norman ruler. These textual recreations, I think, set the stage for all of these really varied and multiple modern retellings, a huge variety of media, especially in the 60s and 70s. So the Broadway musical Camelot from 1960 with Richard Harris in the role of Arthur, this amazing 1975 progressive rock album by Rick Wakeman, and of course the satirical Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which is also from 1975. And the special appearance of Arthur in Marvel Comics alongside, these modern heroes, Batman and Superman. And since then, Arthur's reach has encompassed a variety of interactive media, video, card games, Japanese manga, illustrating the kind of huge influence that these stories really continue to have. And of course, the Disney Sword in the Stone, as well as live action movies, Excalibur, First Knight. All of these things are related to the T.H. White retelling, especially. And then kind of going back to the quote unquote historical King Arthur, 2004's King Arthur, and then Guy Ritchie's King Arthur Legend of the Sword kind of set this story among the fall of the Roman Empire as opposed to the high Middle Ages of First Knight. And then more recent takes, Netflix's Cursed and A24's The Green Knight, give us a sense of the contemporary Arthur, which features actors of color in central roles and plot lines and visuals that embrace the realm of fantasy and magic specifically. And so I'm thinking about this like very long tradition of Arthur retellings. What drew you to Arthur specifically, and sort of what made you want to retell the story with Guinevere at the center?
Yeah, so I've always loved Arthurian stories, Sword in the Stone when I was younger. First Knight came out when I was in high school, and I thought it was so dreamy, and I rewatched a few years ago with my own teen daughter, and I was like, oh, wow, this is problematic. But, those types of stories, I always really loved and I really enjoyed, but I always wanted more women in them. I always wanted more girls in them. And then in college, I studied Mallory's Arthur, and I was really, really fascinated by it. And I was so fascinated by the sort of tension in it, where they're setting up this king who's ushering in a new era of essentially Christian kingdoms, but he's given the power to rule by what would have been like a local pagan deity, right? The woman in the lake, the lady of the lake. And that sort of tension between those two is really, really fascinating to me, how you can go from wizards and fairies and ladies and lakes to, and now he's going to go get the Holy Grail. Like it's such a fascinating crossroads to me of that transition, and how Arthur is sort of at the center of it. And then, as I got older and I engaged more with more of these stories, I loved T.H. White's retelling, obviously, and the complexity and the compassion that he showed to Guinevere, which I had not seen in a lot of previous material that I had engaged with. And then, as I moved on in my career and I was attracted to retellings, I've done historical retellings, I've done a Frankenstein retelling. For me, retellings are always rooted in two things. They're rooted in a deep, deep love of the source material, and also something about it that really bothers me. And one thing that consistently bothers me, and not all Arthurian adaptations, but a lot of them treat Guinevere very poorly. And, that bothers me. That bothers me that, you'll have these stories where men can go out and do anything they want, and they, do terrible things, they do great things, whatever. But the one thing that's going to ruin it all is a woman falling in love. And so I really wanted to humanize Guinevere. I wanted to make her the central character in her own story, which she never is. And once I started going down that path, I started thinking about whose stories we tell. Why are we always telling Arthur's story? Why are we always telling the story of a sword? Because a sword is a tool to kill, right? That's what a sword does. A sword ends lives. Why aren't we telling other stories in Camelot? And so I sometimes joke that I want to write the Real Housewives of Camelot, and just kind of look at who are the people on the sidelines of these stories. Who are the people that are being left behind in Camelot when the men are going out and creating a new world on the edge of a sword? And then, whose stories are getting cut short by those swords? What are the aftermaths? Because so often in Arthurian literature, it's here's the big battle. Okay, let's move on. Even Guinevere, in a lot of the earliest times she appears, she's a footnote. It's like, Arthur did this battle, and Arthur did this battle, and Arthur did this battle. Oh yeah, and then he married this girl who was the daughter of so-and-so. And then he did this battle, and then he did this battle. And so for me, it was very much I love Arthurian stories. I love the whole tradition, but I want to see something there um, that I haven't fully found. Which isn't to say
Mhm.
there aren't adaptations that have done really interesting, complex things with the women of Camelot. But for me, I really, really wanted Guinevere to be the heart of the story.
Mhm. That's so interesting because I feel like, something that I am always thinking about is how connected the Arthur stories of any particular time are to that time and place. They
Mhm.
really tell us more about the time and place in which they're created than anything about King Arthur.
Yes.
And so, what about our current moment do you think means that Guinevere can have this kind of expanded role, or sort of what is the relevance of a character like Guinevere to today's readers?
Yeah, I think just examining power and who gets to
Mhm.
have it and why they get to have it. I mean, there's definitely a reason that this series came about after a certain election cycle, both that I needed to escape somewhere romantic and fantastical and dreamy, but also because I needed to take a woman whose power is compassion, whose strength is looking at people and meeting them where they are, but also seeing who they could be if they had the support that they needed. I wanted to see a woman like that have power and be successful.
Mhm.
And so for me, it was very much a conversation with who gets to have power, why they get to have power, and what types of power we value and why we don't value these other types of power. And that's really rooted throughout the series. You see in the series magic is outlawed, which in theory is a good thing because they've got this fairy queen who wants to destroy everything. But who uses magic in Camelot? Women use magic, and they use small magic to help each other, to protect each other, to keep themselves safe, to try and find little bits of power in a society that doesn't give them any. And so when you
Mhm.
outlaw magic, you're saying you can no longer have the ability to protect yourselves because we'll protect you. But we know it doesn't work like that. And
Mhm.
so I rooted the power in very traditionally feminine craft. So it's all in tying knots and sewing, and you can create these little finite limited pieces of protection and of strength for yourself and for the people that you love and want to look out for. So yeah, it was for me a lot of both engaging with current events and also with stories that I've told in the past, particularly the Anti-Darken trilogy, which is a gender-swapped retelling of Vlad the Impaler's history.
Mhm.
And so that main character, Lotta, pursues power down a very traditionally masculine pathway. And I'm using masculine and feminine knowing that it's a false binary that we created, but we create it, so we engage with it. And so she pursues power through violence and through ruthlessness. And I really wanted to show through Guinevere this other pathway toward power, and this way of creating power in yourself, but also extending that power to everyone that you come in contact with.
Mhm. So when you approach this kind of stories with this the sort of weight of history, right? Like there's so much here. How do you decide kind of what to keep from the tradition and what to leave behind, or sort of what to create anew?
Yeah, especially when you're engaging with Arthuriana, it can get very, very overwhelming.
Yes.
Um, yeah, when I set out to write this, I was like, I'm going to make it super historical. I'm going to set it in 5th century England. And then I was like, don't do this to yourself again. Part of the fun of Arthurian tradition is that it's always been out of time, right?
Mhm.
People anchor it um, anachronistically constantly. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to participate in the long, proud tradition of anachronisms in Arthurian literature.
Mhm.
But also, there are so many versions. There's a lot of arguments in literary fiction, particularly circles about canon. Like, what is canon? What isn't canon? And I always laugh when people are like, "Oh, I don't know very much about the Arthur canon," and I'm like, "Guess what? There isn't any because it's always been communal storytelling, like the
Mhm.
beautiful art you see. Somebody liked that story, so they made this piece, and somebody liked that piece, and so they made this piece. And it's been just a chain of inspiration where somebody heard about an Arthur, thought he sounded interesting, wrote something about him. Somebody read that and liked it and wrote something about that, so on and so forth down the centuries, which is really exciting as a creator, but also really intimidating because, do I use Mallory as my base? Do I use
Mhm.
Tennyson? Do I go even farther back? And so it got to a certain point where I realized I was never going to write the books. I was just going to research Arthurian
Research forever.
forever. And I mean, and it's so fun. And there's so much that I wish that I could have included, like Lancelot's half giant best friend, whose name I cannot pronounce. But there's a whole sequence of stories about Lancelot going out and this half giant being so impressed with Lancelot's prowess on the battlefield that he gives up fighting Arthur and joins them and is Lancelot's best friend, to the point where, I mean, it also has a lot of homoerotic subtext, which is wonderful. To the point where Lancelot's death is falsely reported to his giant best friend, and he dies of a broken heart. And then when Lancelot dies, he's buried next to him. And I'm like, that is so beautiful and so sweet. But like, there was no room for that in my story. And that's when you're doing a retelling and when you're engaging with something with such a long history of storytelling tradition like Arthur, you really have to pick and choose. So for me, it came down to the archetypes. I wanted the archetypal Arthur as the Golden King. I wanted the archetypal Mordred as sort of like a puckish figure, like you never quite know, is he good, is he bad, like what are his motivations? And archetypal Morgana and archetypal Guinevere, so that you can both build on those archetypes, but then also subvert them. One of the ones that I was really, really interested in subverting is Merlin. Because if you read so many of the traditional stories, Merlin is absolutely reprehensible. And he leaves a trail of women's bodies in his wake as he's moving Arthur to power. Women are just constantly killed in his
But the way that he's changed over time, I mean, I think people don't necessarily kind of associate that kind of character trait with Merlin. We think of him as kind of a kindly old wizard who has King Arthur's best interests at heart and sort of doesn't have his own political motivations, but you've really turned that on its head.
Yeah, so in this case, I'm de-rehabbing Merlin's image and I'm rehabbing Guinevere's image. So yeah, it was just, it's always a challenge when you're engaging with these things with retellings. And so in the end, you really just have to decide what is going to serve my story best while still paying homage and being respectful of the storytelling traditions that I'm being part of.
What I think is so great about the Arthur tradition is that it is so big and it is so flexible that it sort of can encompass these changes and these kind of interventions really easily, and it feels kind of natural for the story. I've sort of thought about Arthur as a cinematic universe in a way. There's like Arthur and Guinevere, this kind of central story, but then there's also all of these other Knights of the Round Table, which kind of get their spin-off series in a way, and they have their own their own kind of narrative,
that's exactly what it is. It's like, oh well, Arthur's played out, we've told so many stories with Arthur, so let's introduce a new knight. And I do love how as the stories progressed, Arthur became more and more of a background figure, which the Green Knight, which recently came out, I felt like did really well, because it's not Arthur's story, he's a background character in it. And then it's
sort of like the next generation. He's presented as this kind of young upcoming knight, where Arthur is kind of older and more experienced and sort of getting out of the knight game, but still kind of overseeing these younger knights. And I think it's such a particular feature of the Arthur tradition in particular, because then when you have kind of these modern takes on the Arthurian legend, it doesn't feel like it doesn't fit, or that it's taking something which has always been the same and, doing something radical with it. I do want to ask you specifically about your decision to gender swap certain characters and kind of introduce the idea of same-sex relationships and these kinds of, I think, more contemporary interventions, which feel, I think, very much of our sort of 21st century moment, but which, I mean, you couldn't have imagined in an Arthurian retelling of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And I'm wondering kind of what spurs those decisions, and kind of how do you see yourself in dialogue with these kind of older traditions when you make those kinds of changes?
I feel like when you read the old stories, it's always there. They just talk around it, like the tale of Lancelot and this half giant. I mean, it was very, very clearly a love story. They never made it explicitly a love story, but you don't die of a broken heart just because you really like the way that guy fights. Like, so it's always been there. And throughout history, you see those stories, but they're talked around. And then the fun thing about being a storyteller now is you don't have to talk around it, you can directly engage with it. And so I picked very carefully. I wanted to explore what it would mean to be a knight on the outside, because Lancelot already kind of is in the traditional stories because of his connection to Guinevere, because he genuinely loves her and sees her as a person, which what a concept.
Radical.
And so I thought, how could I make it clear why Lancelot has this level of compassion, why Lancelot has this level of understanding and connection with Guinevere. And so from very early on, I decided Lancelot is a woman who cannot and will not conform to gender standards of the day. So how will that work? How will that bring in drama? How can we get around, the rules that would prevent her from being who she knows she is? And then I also decided to take the story of Tristan and Isolde and change their dynamic from friendship, or from love to friendship. And because when you read that story, Isolde's maid is like hardcore. She is like way too invested in Isolde. And in Isolde's life. And so I thought, well, okay, but if there's more there, if there's a love story there, then it makes sense to me that she would go to such extreme lengths to try and intervene, to try and create a world in which Isolde can be happy. And so, when you're doing retellings, you look for the space between stories. You look for those little details where you're like, oh, I feel like something else could be there. But then, in the end too, I want to tell stories that are reflective of the people that I know, the friends that I have, that are reflective of my own teenagers and their lives and the ways that they're engaging with the world. And so I very much wanted to make those aspects of the story kind of a non-issue, where people know that it's happening, and they either engage with it or ignore it, and it's never the crux of the story. But yeah, it's important to me to have those focuses in my books, to have that representation, and I feel like it's honest too. Like I feel like those aspects of storytelling have always been part of Arthuriana. It's just been engaged with in slyer and less direct ways.
Something that is, I think, fascinating to me as a visual person is the kind of approach to the world building in Arthur stories. And we sort of always think of Arthur as being some sort of medieval, but there's versions like First Knight, Excalibur, which really set the story in the 14th, 15th centuries in Northern Europe. Then there's these sort of attempts to go back to the historical Arthur, or the real history of Arthur, which I think is sort of adorable, but I like it anyway. And you have this kind of like recasting of Arthur as a Roman military commander and all of these kind of historical interventions. And I'm wondering how you think about the kind of intersection of history when you're thinking about your world, and then also how magic kind of gets layered into that and the kind of play between those two things.
Yeah. So with mine, like I said, I did initially want to make it very historical and very rooted in 5th century England, which is difficult because it's hard to find actual information on 5th century anywhere. And so I tried to find kind of a middle ground where I wasn't all the way in like stone castles and knights on horses and jousting. So I tried to root it in as much real history as I could. I read a lot of books. I read one of my favorite series is the Time Traveler's Guide to, and in this case, I used the Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, just to kind of get an idea of like, how would cities function? How did they get rid of their waste? What building materials were they using? What would constitute a large city at the time? Because fantasy, you have to build the world for the reader, but historical, you have to do the same. You have to give the reader context so they understand the world that they're moving through. It's part of why I love these collections at the Getty, because it gives so much context to the world at the time. I think we tend to sterilize and make medieval times very, very serious. But you look at their art and you look at their sense of humor. Like I am obsessed with knights fighting snails.
Oh, everyone is. This is like this is the most popular question I think that we get. And my answer is always sort of like, well, did you think medieval people never told a joke for 1,000 years?
Yeah, I'm like, that's their meme. They're making memes, and their meme is a knight fighting a snail. We actually have shirts of goofy medieval art in our house. We have we love it.
I love it.
And then, the tradition of rabbits horrendously murdering other animals, or knights. All these things, like they were funny. They were joyful. We were able to visit a castle in Romania called Hunedoara Castle, and it's a very old castle, and you can still see the remnants of the paint. And so whenever we portray medieval times or pre-medieval times, everything is rock, everything is gray, everything is poorly lit. But if you look at what they actually would have looked like, that whole tower would have been painted in bright red and white stripes, and the interiors would have been whitewashed. And they really took a lot of care, and they wanted things to be beautiful, and things would have been beautiful because they had amazing artisans. And so I think anytime you can really anchor it in the history, but also make it clear that, like, these people weren't like scrambling around in the mud. They had art, they had science, they had all of these things that made their lives better. Then you can draw those parallels and make it more relatable to a modern reader, and also give that sense of, yeah, these things happen. Not these things didn't actually happen. This is fantasy, but the time periods that we're portraying and these stories that we're engaging with, they were real, and they had the same needs and desires and loved the same things that we do now.
It's a way of making magic and kind of these more fantastical aspects a little bit more believable and sort of, yeah, as you're saying, sort of grounded in a real time and place, even though extraordinary things happen. And there are these kinds of aspects of magic, as you're saying, kind of woven through the books and the narratives. I'm wondering how you think about the kind of interaction of that magic with the people and places that you're describing in the book too. Sort of, what is the limit of magic in your novels?
And that's one thing as a writer, you really have to have limits, and there have to be rules, and it has to be a closed system, because otherwise everyone would use it, right? Like if there are no consequences. And so for the Camelot Rising trilogy, I very deliberately made two types of magic. I made the sort of more elemental magic that wasn't used by humans, by regular people. So it's what Merlin uses, it's what the Dark Fairy Queen uses, it's what the Lady of the Lake uses. And then I used a very finite, very simple, and not particularly powerful type of magic, which is the one I was talking about that women use. And that one was actually inspired by the Malleus Maleficarum, which is from the medieval time. And I never remember what the author's name was, because he was a tiny, small, terrible man, and I don't ever want to give him credit, because it was a bad book. It was an evil book. It was a book that was used to persecute women. But I read it, and it was so silly. It was so absurd. These things that they would claim were evidence of magic as a way to persecute and kill women. And one of them was knots. If your horse isn't running as fast as, and you look in his mane and he has knots, that's your independent neighbor that you don't like. Or you go up into your attic and there are ropes in your attic and there are knots in the rope. That's your independent neighbor that you don't like. And like, of course there are going to be knots in those things. And so I thought, I want to reclaim that. I want to take that back. And the idea of tying little pieces of magic and knotting little pieces of power into your sewing, into your clothes, into your hair. It's such a tangible thing, and such a real thing to kind of balance out these bigger elemental, unknowable, unchangeable magics. And it's reflective of Arthuriana in general, right? Because so much of Arthurian is moving from these big, unknowable, very nature-based magic into the rule of man. So.
And in the medieval tradition, this kind of, as you said at the beginning, this push and pull between Christianity and the former pagan world, and the kind of literary interventions that medieval writers are making into the story, which sort of introduces the idea of the Holy Grail and all of these things, which
magic,
do,
but,
definitely also a kind of magic, but which further and further embroider the story and kind of take it in all of these different directions. And so I sort of see your interventions, I think, as part of this continuum. And I'm sort of wondering if you see that as well. Do you see yourself sort of participating in this long history, and kind of what do you hope happens to Arthuriana next? What's the sort of next step?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I had had my way, it would have been a lot more about imperialism, and it would have been a lot more about sort of the tyranny of religious intervention. But in the end, I was writing a fantasy series for teens, and so I kind of had to pull myself back from those themes, at least engaging with them on on a more critical, deeper level, which, you know,
Mhm.
maybe I will again someday in the future, because who's to say you can't retell the same thing more than once.
Of course.
Um,
Not in Arthuriana. You know, you can
yeah,
tell the same
exactly,
thing 1,000 times and never get sick of
exactly.
it.
Yeah, yeah, but I like that, and I like and it was very important to me. Again, like I said, a lot of the crux of this series is who gets to have power and why, and what can they do with that power, and what should they do with that power, and that's the type of Arthurian retellings that I'm really into now. That I really enjoy. I loved the Green Knight. I loved this concept of he is inheriting power, but does he deserve it? What is he going
Mhm.
to have to do? How is he going to have to change as a person in order to be in any way worthy of wielding power over other people? There's a young adult series that started with a book called Legend, born by Tracy Dion, and it's Arthurian, but it's set in modern day real world, and it engages with classism and racism in really, really interesting and thoughtful ways. And that's what I love, is people taking these storytelling traditions and building on them, or asking questions with them. And that for me is the power of these archetypal stories, of these stories that everyone knows. It allows you an inroad to engage with both those stories and the real world in really interesting and dynamic ways.
Mhm. Thinking about too, writing for specifically a teenage audience and a younger audience, why do you think that these stories continue to be so powerful for these younger audiences who are kind of maybe just approaching the tradition through your novels or through kind of more recent Arthuriana?
Mhm.
Um, what are they getting out of it? Sort of why are they still so powerful for younger readers?
It, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I'm always really curious as to what younger readers will go for and what they won't. For
Mhm.
example, in young adult literature, every few years, somebody tries to make Westerns happen again, and teen readers don't want it. They are just like, don't care. Um, but these big fantasy stories where it's rooted in fantasy and those big feelings and those big firsts, I think, especially with the story of Arthur and Guinevere, there are so many really big, dramatic, over the top. There's longing, there's betrayal, there's literal magic, and I think that's really appealing as a teen reader. As you know, you're moving through the world and you're moving toward adulthood, to have these sort of escapes into wonder and romance, where they're still doing the same thing you are. They're still trying to figure out who they are, what impact they can have on the world, what impact they want to have on the world. But you know, they're doing it in gorgeous dresses and crowns and in forests with dragons. So I think, yeah, it's the same appeal that Arthuriana has for everyone, where you've got these
Mhm.
universal themes and these universal questions, but the dressing is so beautiful.
Mhm. It's sort of timeless in a way, but also extremely time bound in a way that
Mhm.
is, I think, really interesting because we're still so drawn to the kind of aesthetics of the medieval and the kind of trappings of the medieval at the same time that these stories, I think you're totally right, do engage with big feelings, big questions. And, you know, the characters in your novels and in really Arthuriana kind of going back are quite young.
Yeah.
And so to kind of experience, I think, those things along with them
Hmm.
feels relatable and kind of very vital in a
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
Totally. All right. Well, unfortunately, we're already at 12:30, so I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm sort of happy to hear what you guys want to know from Kirsten or about Arthuriana more generally. Um, oh, sorry. So we have one question that says the plotline detail that magic is outlawed in Camelot. You have that in common with the TV show Merlin. Is that coincidental, or are you kind of thinking about that show as well?
It
Speaking of a long tradition of Arthuriana and all different media.
Yeah, it actually is coincidental. So I've known for several years that I wanted to write an Arthurian story. And so I opted out of most modern engagement with Arthurian retellings
Mm-hmm.
while I was sort of formulating what I wanted to do, because I didn't want to be influenced by what other people were doing,
Mm-hmm.
what other contemporary retellings were doing. So, you know, I was mostly engaging with older things, or the things that were so incredibly absurd, I didn't feel like they would influence me, such as King Arthur and the Legend of the Sword by Guy Ritchie. And so no, I actually had not engaged with Merlin at all. But it is interesting that, you know, you see a lot of similar themes cropping up, and it's because you were all drawing from the same pool of storytelling and
Mhm.
of engaging with Arthurian.
Yeah. This is a good question. The medieval stories themselves are obviously fictional. How do you feel that your books interact with or differ from the fictional strategies of the medieval literature?
Oh, I love the medieval literature because I love how episodic it is. I love, like, that's one of the things that I loved about the Green Knight is it's so random. It's like, and then he goes here and, then there's this girl and he needs to go get her head out of a lake. Okay, done, moving on. And I love the medieval storytelling traditions where it really is. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then they died. Um, but,
That's
when
how
you're
we
writing
assume.
for modern audiences, you do have to have a little bit more of a plot. I did try to sort of mirror that episodic theme where there are multiple like smaller adventures that take place in each of the books. And I also really loved the characters telling each other stories. So several
Mhm.
times throughout the novels, the characters will tell each other stories about the knights, and even then you can see how these stories are already turning into legend and myth in the way that they're telling them, in the corrections that the people who were actually there make later, like didn't actually happen like that. Um, and so I had a lot of fun with sort of the whose stories are we telling and why are we telling them.
Mhm.
My favorite though is there are two knights. One of them is named Devane, and he has a brother who is also named Devane. So you have Devane, and then you have Yvain, and they're brothers. But one of them has a lion, and one of them is known as Yvain the Bastard. So I'm like, gosh, that one got the shaft.
Mhm.
And kind of engaging slyly with telling these stories and having me like, wait, which Yvain? But yeah, it was it's always fun participating in that or acknowledging that, while at the same time realizing that if you are telling a contemporary story for contemporary audiences, you do have to make certain I can't think of the word.
Sort of concessions for a modern
Concessions,
audience.
that is the word. Yes, you have to make certain concessions toward plot and toward pacing, um,
Mhm.
which is always a little bit of a bummer.
Yeah, I
But
know. The Green Knight was a funny instance, I think, because it did feel so true to the
yes,
spirit of the medieval
yeah.
story, and it's sort of intensely visual,
Hmm.
loosely connected via plot,
Hmm.
but very beautiful also. Um, there's a couple of questions about the Mists of Avalon, which I'll kind of wrap into one question. How do you see your work kind of vis-a-vis the Mists of Avalon, which also aim to kind of rehab some of the female characters of the Arthur stories? And related to that, how do you create the kind of female personality of someone like Guinevere? How does she look? All of these things.
I will say, in regards to the Mists of Avalon, I don't engage with that one. I don't ever promote it. The author was a terrible predator who was convicted of participating in just incredibly depraved harming of children. And so I haven't read that. I don't ever promote it. I recognize that it was a foundational text for a lot of women because it presented the women of Avalon in a pseudo feminist form before anybody else did. And I can recognize it had personal importance and significance to people, but the author was a terrible person. And so yeah, so I don't ever bring it up, but if it is brought up, I feel it's important to mention that,
Mhm.
because that is her legacy. um as far as creating actual women out of these characters, I just think, like, so often in Arthuriana, women are presented as one thing. So Guinevere is the queen who is going to portray Arthur. Morgana is the witch who's trying to take him down. Or if there are two women in a story, they have to be in competition with each other. There's an entire cycle where Guinevere's younger sister, Guinevere, has been kidnapped once again. She's always getting kidnapped. And her younger sister, Guinevere, comes to Camelot and essentially tries to just straight up take her place, tries to marry
Mhm.
Arthur, tries to usurp her role. And so for me, I really wanted to make sure that I had a large cast of women and that they were all real people and that they were all seen and valued as real people, rather than if there's a woman who has a role and there's another woman, they must necessarily be in competition. And
Mhm.
I don't think it's hard. I don't think it's difficult to write complex, fully realized women. And
Mhm.
even in these books where the women are in conflict with the things that they want, they can still see and respect each other and engage with each other in complex ways.
Mhm. And interact with each other have conversations and have complex relationships that are outside of the kind of male characters in the story as well. The kind
Exactly,
of
exactly.
literary Bechdel test.
Yeah, yeah. I did get one criticism of the series where somebody was like, I wanted there to be more of the knights in there. And I was like, it's literally called the Guinevere deception. Like, I feel like the knights have gotten their day in the sun. Like, there's lots of knights stories. You can also read those. That's fine.
That is true. I'll kind of bring it back to the idea of medieval Arthuriana. Is there a certain era, language, or genre of medieval Arthurian literature that draws you in, and why?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Mallory girl. I loved the
Mhm,
Mallory. I loved the strangeness of it. I loved that tension between the old and the new, the paganism and the Christianity, and the way that Arthur is kind of like the linchpin at the center of all of it.
mhm,
Um, I also really love like the super dreamy art of like
mhm.
Elaine and the Lady of the Lake and the very tragic, very beautiful art. While also I hate that all the women are tragic, but it's really really lovely, and I enjoy looking at it.
Mhm. This person notes the use of not magic as inspiration, really inspiring because it is connected to other kind of indigenous practices, especially the Maya in Central America. The question is, how would you center your literature within the upswell of movements reconnecting with pre-modern or traditional art and beliefs?
Yeah, I try to be very very aware of what I'm drawing from. eh, Not so much as a staying in my own lane, but as a way of being respectful and being thoughtful. So for this,
Mhm,
I try to anchor everything on British history, on British traditions. I bring in the northern people who are known as the Picts, and they have sort of their own belief system. But I try not to draw from other traditions that wouldn't have directly impacted that, and that I don't have a background to fully engage with.
mhm,
And so yeah, it's always a difficult thing when you're engaging with history, and because it's never going to be your culture, because my culture was not, you know 10th century England or whatever. Um, but yeah, I do think it's really interesting when you can anchor stories using those elements of the past and be as faithful to them as you can and respectful as you can. I think there's a lot of weight and power that can be found in re-engaging with those things.
mhm. And thinking about the kinds of people that you're sort of giving power back to in your
Mhm.
books, what's how can we expand that universe, and sort of do you see that these kinds of narrative strategies being extended to BIPOC characters? What's happening in young adult literature now to kind of expand the storytelling capability?
Yeah, that is actually one of the most exciting things that's happening more recently in publishing, particularly in young adult publishing, is people from traditionally marginalized backgrounds, people whose stories were not seen as having value or being commercial enough, are more and more not enough, but still more than they used to be, being given opportunities to tell those stories. Like I mentioned, Tracy Dion's Legendborn. That's such a fantastic way of engaging with Arthuriana, but also with it's a very modern American story. There is a whole series of retellings being published right now. The most recent one is called Travelers Along the Way by Mina May Safi, and
Mm-hmm,
it is a retelling of Robin Hood. But the characters are mostly girls. They are Muslim. It engages with history in a very interesting, very real way. So I feel like there is a lot of really exciting storytelling being done, where instead of seeing, the way that we've always been given Arthur, over and over again, you get the white dude who's Arthur, who's going to save everybody.
mm-hmm,
You see more people engaging with it in interesting ways and expanding it, and either retelling those stories from a point of view that we hadn't gotten before.
mm-hmm.
Happens with a lot with fairy tales. Julie C. Dowell's Forest of a Thousand Lanterns reimagined Snow White using her own Vietnamese heritage of storytelling. Rick Riordan Presents for younger readers has a really really cool line. Where authors tell new stories influenced and using the mythology of their own cultural backgrounds. And it's so fun, and it's such a great way of expanding the ways that we engage with these stories that we know, of introducing new stories to ourselves and to our children. I feel like it's a really exciting time in children's and young adult literature. And I hope that it continues. I hope that it just continues to grow, and that more and more seats are given at this round table of storytelling.
That's a great note to end on. It's the idea of sort of mobilizing the medieval and medieval storytelling to tell more inclusive and sort of more equitable stories to newer readers, and expanding this universe, the cinematic multiverse, as it were. So Kirsten, thank you so much. If we didn't get a chance to answer your all of your questions, sorry. We had a lot, but Kirsten, thank you so much for joining me. This has been really fun to talk about Arthur, and yeah, best of luck for future roundtable endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
And for those of you who are interested in art breaks, I'll plug an upcoming art break about an ancient Greek drinking cup coming up later this month. So please join us for that. And Kirsten, again, thank you so much. And we will see you all virtually at another Getty program. Thanks so much.